Okay. Before you write your hate comments, I just want to let you know that the title to this YouTube video, Should You Waste Your Time Reading Les Mis, that is a bit of clickbait because I did love Les Mis. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but I will say that this book could be a waste of time depending on where you are in your reading life. Again, I loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but I think you have to be ready for it. You have to be ready to know what you're getting into before you read it. And let me explain what I mean here. Oh, and I just want to tell you this before I forget it. By the end of this video, you will know whether or not you want to read Les Mis, whether or not you're in the point in your life where you should, or maybe you just, maybe it's just not the book for you, even if you do like to read the more difficult classics.
Okay, sorry about the little mistake there, but let's get back to explaining what I mean about how you have to be in the right reading mindset to enjoy Les Mis.
So I'm thinking back to, I don't know, maybe about 8 years ago when I was the mother to 2 very young children, and every day I would, go to bed. I use that term loosely. I would collapse on my bed for a few hours and just, my brain was fried pretty much constantly, right? At that point in my life, reading Les Mis would have been a waste of time for me. I think this book, it is a lot of work. It is in many ways homework, but it's worth it if you're prepared. At that time in my life, I really had to stick to pleasure reading and really only books on audio because even just looking at something on the page, to me, my brain would just be like, and I had to focus on honestly, just stupid romances and stuff like that. That's all I could focus on, right? Now, if you are going to read Les Mis, I do recommend reading it with a buddy. I actually read it with a friend because there are parts of it that are very tedious. So if you're reading it with a friend like I was, you're sort of keeping yourself on pace, right? Sometimes I would get a little bit ahead or sometimes she would get a little bit ahead and then I would text her and I'd be like, oh, I'm on page 650, where are you? She'd be a little behind. So then that would, sort of get the fire burning underneath her to keep us, on top of things. But even with that, this took me a little bit over 3 months to read. It's 1,400 pages. And the reason why it took me that long to read it is because I couldn't do it in big increments. I actually tried to do that. I gave myself the goal of reading it in 1 month. And that was just, honestly, it was just too much. So then my friend and I, we really just stuck to trying to read maybe, 10 to 20 pages every day. I tried to do 100 pages a week if I could. Okay, so let me put this book down. I don't need to hold it this whole time. So before we talk any more about what type of reader you need to be to read with Les Mis, let's just talk a little bit about what Les Mis is even about. I actually didn't even really know when I started the book. The book takes place in the early 1800s in France. Large parts of it are in Paris. It's known as a book that really describes Paris, and it really does. But parts of it are actually outside of Paris, and this part kind of confused me a little bit. So the beginning parts are outside of Paris, more in northern France, but then a good majority of it are in Paris. And people actually think that this book is set around the French Revolution. It's actually not. Technically, the French Revolution was from 1789 to 1799. But, I think I can understand why people get confused because the French Revolution, it didn't quite end cleanly, right? It was just constant revolution, really, after that, throwing monarchs out, bringing them back in, all these uprisings. This book actually centers around what is called the June Uprising of 1832. A bunch of people got really mad at the monarch at the time. I think it was Louis Philippe. They got really mad. There's about 100,000 people who participated in this uprising. It actually wasn't really all that successful, but the story, a large part of it centers around that, even though the book does span many, many years. It starts, I believe, in 1815. And even though it includes a cast of many characters, the main character that it revolves around is a man named Jean Valjean. And it's really about the evolution of his character. And really, the character arc of Jean Valjean is the most beautiful part of the book. It will leave a tear in your eye at the end. He basically starts out as a very poor peasant. Then he becomes a convict for stealing a loaf of bread for his sister and her children. And so much happens in between. I can't really explain it to you. There are so many characters in this book. And I would recommend that if you do decide to read Les Miserables, that you keep a journal of the characters, because one mistake that I made is I did not do that. And then so sometimes I would have to Google who these characters were because because Victor Hugo, he does talk about a character, and you don't know if that character is important or not. He might talk about this character for a little bit, and then 300 pages later, he mentions this character again, and you can't remember his name, so you Google him because you're like, wait, is this, person, is this girl, is this guy, are they important? I have no idea. But one thing I hate about character wikis is that they give so many spoilers. They always tell you if the character dies. So I actually accidentally found out what happened to a couple characters, and it really pissed me off. So I would recommend that you keep a little journal of the characters. This book is also a love story. It features a very beautiful and very tender love story that I enjoyed reading about very much. This book is a lot about love. And in fact, one could argue that is the main theme of this book is love, not only between, two amorous love between two people, but also the love of a father for a daughter, the love of a grandfather for a grandson, the love of country. I mean, so much of it is about love. Reading this book really made me understand that literature meme where they talk about the French writer and, he says, I will die for love. The American writer says, I will die for freedom. And the English writer says, I will die for honor. And then the Russian writer says, I will die. Obviously, it's making fun of the Russian writers, but I understand why the theme talks about the French really just getting so heavily into this theme of love. It really is a book about love. But the reason why this book is so tedious and so difficult in parts is because Victor Hugo, he just goes on these tangents sometimes. There were certain chapters in the book where I felt like I wasn't even reading about the story. I was reading a magazine article, that would have been published in a hipster magazine in 1832 France. And he's just dropping all these names and these political references that honestly, I don't even know if there is a person alive today that would understand every single reference that is in this book. I mean, I can imagine there must just be so many people and places and just political things that happen that have just been forgotten by history, right? I mean, it's basically been 200 years, a little bit less, but 200 years since this book has been published. And, sometimes people, they're just, while they were important back then, they're just not that important anymore. So they're forgotten. And so, it was just, sometimes I just got so tired of trying to Google what he even meant, because most of the time there wasn't anything on Google to even describe it. And then he just goes on these tangents, right? He went on a 60-page tangent on the Battle of Waterloo, and it was tangentially related to the story. Yes, it was related. It did come back to something that happened at the end of that 60 pages where that was related to the plot of the story. But it's like, did I have to suffer through 60 pages of going just into the details about the Battle of Waterloo? No, it was so boring. But honestly, the most boring was the chapter on argot. And argot is essentially slang, the slang of the lower classes. Let me just show you, and please comment below. If you didn't find this tedious, I'm just blown away. How could you not find this tedious? I mean, let me just read this for you. Sorry, and I need my glasses because I'm in my 40s now. So, pigritia is a terrible word. It engenders a world. La pigre, read, robbery, and a hell. La pigrine, read, hunger. So idleness is a mother. She has a son, robbery, and a daughter, hunger. Where are we now? In argot. What is argot? It is at the same time the nation and the idiom. It is robbery under its two aspects, people and language. 34 years ago, the narrator of this grave and gloomy story introduced into a work written with the same aim as the present one, a robber who talked argot, and there was amazement and shock. What? Argot? But argot is hideous. Why? It's the language of convicts, of the galleys, of prison, and all that is most abominable in society, etc., etc., etc. We never understood this sort of objection. Since then, two powerful novelists, one of whom is a profound observer of the human heart, and the other an intrepid friend of the people, Balzac and Eugene Sue, having made bandits talk in their natural tongue as the author of Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné, sorry, excuse my French, had done in 1828, the same outcry was made. It was repeated. What do these writers mean by this revolting patois? Argot is appalling. Argot makes us shudder. Who would deny it? Where the purpose is to probe a wound, an abyss, or society. Since when has it been a crime to descend too far, to plummet to the bottom? We had always thought it was sometimes an act of courage, and at the very least a simple and useful act, worthy of the sympathetic attention merited by duty accepted and accomplished. Not explore the hall, not study the hole, stop halfway. Why? To stop is the job of the plumb and not of the sounder. Certainly, to go to the lowest depths of the social order where the earth ends and the mire begins, to search in those thick waters, to pursue, seize, and cast up, still throbbing, onto the pavement, this abject idiom streaming with filth, as it is dredged up into the light this way, this pustulous vocabulary in which each word seems a huge ring from some monster of the slime and darkness, is neither an attractive nor an easy task. Nothing is gloomier than contemplating the teeming horror of argot, thus bared by the light of thought. It seems, in fact, like a species of horrible beast made for the night, just wrenched out of its cesspool. We seem to be seeing a frightful living... Okay, I gotta stop. I can't do it. So that's what I mean by the tedious parts of this book. So again, please comment below, if you think I am an unsophisticated serf because I can't enjoy that, maybe I am. I've actually seen on the internet, there are people who have written giant blogs about Les Mis, and they basically write the pages that you can skip because it's just political diatribes that have no meaning. I mean, even you could argue the very beginning of the book, it goes on for about 68 pages before you're even introduced to Jean Valjean when it talks about a certain priest. In my opinion, you don't need 68 pages to talk about the priest. That's just my opinion. He could have done it in 20. But regardless, I did think it was a great book. Another thing that I really enjoyed about the book, I mean, the main reason that I picked it up is because we are going to Paris this summer, and I wanted to read kind of, you know, the seminal book about Parisian life. And I did feel that I got a really good understanding of what it was like to live in Paris in the early 1800s. Victor Hugo, he really did bring it alive. In many ways, I felt like I was there. So that part I loved. And then I loved the story. I loved the character arc of Jean Valjean, the character arc of other characters as well. It was a great book. I understand why it's a classic. Again, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. But again, it is homework. And in many ways, I wish I actually would have read this book in college with a professor, with somebody who was actually knowledgeable of what Victor Hugo was talking about in a lot of these chapters. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think in many of these chapters, I was reading it trying to sort of absorb the bigger themes, the more important themes. But a lot of it I felt was over my head. Oops, sorry, that was my husband. I actually work from home. I'm trying to get some videos, you know, kind of in during lunchtime, and he called me and he's like, there's a Zoom call, they had the time wrong, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now I'm done with the Zoom call. I don't actually remember where I was other than to say that Les Miserables, yes, the title of this video is clickbait. It is worth your time. It is a great classic piece of literature, arguably one of the greatest books ever written. 5 out of 5 stars from me, but you have to be in the right state of mind if you are going to be reading this book.